What's up, guys? It's V Renee. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. As you can tell, I'm a lot happier than I was when I had to talk about a book I despised last week, because this week we are talking about what is now easily one of my top 3 favorite books ever. And I just finished it last night. I read like almost the whole thing yesterday, and I wasn't gonna film this video because I wanted to give myself a couple days to like ruminate on my opinions. I can't wait anymore. I have no one to talk about this book with, and I need to talk about it. I am losing my mind excited. We're gonna talk about Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I don't have a lot to say about it. Not a lot. No, not at all. I didn't mark literally almost every page because I read something poignant or interesting or disturbing or well written or beautiful or funny. Oh my god. First of all, this is going to be full of spoilers, so if you want to read Mexican Gothic, and I think you should if you're a fan of Shirley Jackson, Gothic literature, if you wanted to like the TV show The Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix but you didn't, 3 times I wrote, "This is what Haunting of Bly Manor wishes that it was." I'm so excited to talk about this with you. I cannot believe how impeccable, oh my god, going from reading fucking Crush to this was just I felt like my soul has been cleansed. I feel like there is hope in the world again for the publishing industry. Okay, let me give you a spoiler-free synopsis first. So this book takes place in 1950s Mexico. We follow Noemi Taboada, and she has this cousin who she kind of grew up with, or who her father kind of sees as another daughter because her parents died. Her name is Catalina, and Catalina got married to this man named Virgil Doyle, and they live out in this place called the High Place. It's like the Doyle family home. And Catalina writes a really disturbing letter to Noemi and her father, and Noemi's kind of like a flighty socialite, but she wants to go to university, which is not okay for women. So her dad's like, okay, you go check on Catalina, come back with squash everything. There's beef between him and the husband. He's squash everything, make sure everything is good with Catalina. You come back and succeed, you can go to university. She's tight. Goes to High Place, and shit gets weird. Weirder, and I never knew what was going on. Not that I never knew what was going on, I never knew what was coming, right? That's literally all I can say to you without spoiling it, is that she goes to the High Place to try to help Catalina, and then things get weird. The thing I love the most, right away, she got a costume party with some random guy that she's kind of seeing or whatever. It's a costume party, and she decides she doesn't want to dress up as a jockey anymore, but her date still dresses up like a horse with a big ass paper mache horse head, and she just doesn't tell him. And then they go home, he drops her off, and he says, "Give me a kiss goodnight." She says, "I've got to run, but you can still have a bit of my lipstick," and takes her cigarette out of her mouth and puts it in his. She is so great. And we get right into it right away. Page 6, she comes home from the party, and her dad's like, "Hey, your cousin's in trouble. You need to go to help her." Noemi had a hard time reading the words, much less making sense of the sentences. The handwriting seemed unsteady. "He is trying to poison me. This house is sick with rot, stinks of decay, brims with every single evil and cruel sentiment. I have tried to hold on to my wits to keep this foulness away, but I cannot, and I find myself losing track of time and thoughts. Please, please. They are cruel and unkind, and they will not let me go. I bar my door, but still they come. They whisper at nights, and I am so afraid of these restless dead, these ghost, fleshless things. The snake eating its tail, the foul ground beneath our feet, the false faces and false tongues, the web upon which the spider walks, making the strings vibrate. I am Catalina Taboada. Catalina, Cata, come out to play. I miss Noemi. I'll pray I'll see you again. You must come for me, Noemi. You have to save me. I cannot save myself as much as I wish to. I am bound, threads like iron through my mind and my skin, and it's there, in the walls. It does not release its hold on me, so I must ask you to spring me free. Cut it from me, stop them now, for God's sake. Hurry, Catalina." Basically, there's tension between Virgil and Catalina's family, aka Noemi and Noemi's dad, because his family used to run the silver mine in the town, and a sickness fell over it, and all the Mexican workers died, and the English people they brought over died, and it was this whole thing. So they're kind of destitute, and so her dad is basically if Virgil and Catalina were divorced, he would have no money. It was pretty clear when they married that his family's funds have run dry, but as long as they are married, he has access to her bank account. It would be beneficial for him to keep Catalina at his home, even if she'd be best off in the city or with us. You think he is that mercenary that he'd put his finances before the welfare of his wife? I don't know him, Noemi. None of us do. That is the problem. So he's just some guy that Catalina married. And something I want to point out that you don't realize that they're doing until it's brought up is that they're speaking in Spanish. They live in Mexico. So all these conversations are taking place in Spanish. And it's only mentioned when she goes to the high place where the Doyles live, who don't really speak Spanish, that she switches to English. So it's always made like, and it's really important. It's an important plot point of like only certain people speak Spanish in the high place, because it's actually what helps them end up being able to plan an escape when things start to get weird. Then she takes the train into the place that the high place is located. It's called El Triunfo. It was clear El Triunfo was not in any guidebooks. It had the musty air of a place that had withered away. The houses were colorful, yes, but the color was peeling from most of the walls. Some of the doors had been defaced. Half of the flowers in the pots were wilting, and the town showed few signs of activity. So right away, this is page 17, we're getting that real good, like, Southern Gothic, not Southern Gothic, Mexican Gothic, obviously, but the Gothic literature, like, everything's in disarray, everything is falling apart, everything's in disrepair. Just every aspect of what people like about Gothic literature, myself included, just ratcheted up to 10 and given a Mexican influence. And I don't know what the fuck took us so long to get to this. What took us so long? Silvia Moreno Garcia is what took us so long, because she was the only one who could write this. This just chef's kiss, dude. Like, I've already bought this. I'm not gonna lie. I finished it yesterday and I immediately bought it. Like, this is from the library, but I bought my own copy because I'm obsessed with the way this woman writes. Like, all of these are just things that I gasped at when I read them because they were so good. Then all of a sudden, they were there, emerging into a clearing, and the house seemed to leap out of the mist to greet them with eager arms. It was so odd. It looked absolutely Victorian in construction, with its broken shingles, elaborate ornamentation, and dirty bay windows. She'd never seen anything like it in real life. It was terribly different from her family's modern house, the apartments of her friends, or the colonial houses with facades of red tizanto. The house loomed over them like a great, quiet gargoyle. It might have been foreboding, evoking images of ghosts and haunted places if it had not seemed so tired, slats missing from a couple of shutters, the ebony porch groaning as they made their way up the steps to the door, which came complete with a silver knocker shaped like a fist dangling from a circle. It's the abandoned shell of a snail. So they get there, and the guy who picks her up is Francis, and Francis is like the youngest son of the patriarch Howard Doyle. It's kind of hard to keep track of the family, honestly. Virgil is Catalina's husband, and he's the oldest son of Howard, who's like the patriarch. And then there's Florence, who I guess is Howard's sister, Howard's niece, Francis's mother, Florence. But Virgil and Francis are brothers. Florence is his niece. Oh, it's all incest anyway, so I guess it doesn't really matter. They might be sister, cousin, aunts. I don't know. Yeah, so Florence, Francis, Virgil, and Howard Doyle, and then Catalina, and then 3 servants who are like mute blank slates, and Catalina. So we meet Florence, meet everybody. Florence sucks. She sucks so hard. Whatever, she's just rude. And she's like, I want to see my cousin Catalina. And she's like, she's busy and she's resting and she's not feeling good. And Naomi's like, I came a long way to see her, so let me see her. All right, cool. Father has sent me to check up on you, Noemi told Catalina. How are you feeling? What's wrong? I feel awful. I had a fever, Noemi. I'm sick with tuberculosis, but I'm feeling better. You wrote to us. Do you remember? You said odd things. I don't quite remember everything I wrote, Catalina said. I had such a high temperature. So basically she's like, I'm sick, I have TB, the family doctor's taking care of me, like, no big deal, sorry, I scared you. And Naomi's like, well, I'm gonna stick around and kind of see what's going on. So then we meet Howard Doyle, the patriarch. Old would have been an inaccurate word to describe him. He was ancient, his face gouged with wrinkles, a few sparse hairs stubbornly attached to his skull. He was very pale too, like an underground creature, a slug perhaps. His veins contrasted with his pallor, thin spidery lines of purple and blue. And Howard Doyle sucks, because Howard Doyle is obsessed with eugenics. And if you don't know what eugenics are, look it up. It's basically why the Holocaust happened. It's basically why people think white supremacy is a thing. It's a master race thing. It's fucking gross. It's disgusting. Yeah, anyways. And So Howard starts talking to Catalina about superior, inferior races. Catalina was correct. You do have an interest in anthropology. Yes, she said. She did not wish to share more than that single word. What are your thoughts on the intermingling of superior and inferior types? He asked, ignoring her discomfort. I think you are a good example of that sort. Of what sort? He smiled again, this time his teeth visible, the lips drawn. The teeth were not yellow as she'd imagined, but porcelain white and whole. But the gums, which she could see clearly, were a noxious shade of purple. Of a new beauty, Miss Taboda. Mr. Vasconcelos makes it very clear that the unattractive will not procreate. Beauty attracts beauty and begets beauty. It is a means of selection. You see, I am offering you a compliment. That is a very strange compliment, she managed to say, swallowing her disgust. You should take it, Miss Taboda. I don't hand them out lightly. So then Virgil, Catalina's husband, finally pulls Noemi aside after dinner and is like, what are you doing here? And she's kind of like, doesn't know how to, she's a flirt with like boys her own age, but he's like older, so she's not really sure how to like approach him. The Kublai Khan sent messengers across his realm who carried a stone with his seal, and whoever mistreated a messenger would be put to death. Let Virgil understand then that Noemi had an invisible stone in her pocket. It was good of you to come on such short notice, Virgil said, though his tone was flat. I had to. Did you really? My father was concerned, she said. There was her stone, even as his own badge was all around him, in this house and its things. Noemi was a Taboda, sent by Leocadio Taboda himself. They went up the stairs, him holding an oil lamp hand-painted with patterns of vines, which made the light emanating from it turn emerald and infused the walls with a strange hue. It painted the velvet curtains green. In one or another of her stories, Catalina had told Noemi, the Kublai Khan executed his enemies by smothering them with velvet pillows, so there would be no blood. She thought this house, with all its fabrics and rugs and tassels, could smother a whole army. Just the way that Sylvia paints this picture of like an ornate, rotting, oppressive, smothering, beautiful, lush, horrid house. Just awful. And then when you find out what's actually going on and what's actually like in the walls and in the people inside, like what's actually happening, you're like, oh, it's so lush and rich and thick. It's almost like something could grow in it. The next day, she's bored because they won't let her see Catalina, so she's wandering around. She wanders into Howard Doyle's study and finds a journal on eugenics research. She reads it, and it says, the idea that the half-bred mestizo of Mexico inherits the worst traits of their progenitors is incorrect. If the stamp of an inferior race afflicts them, it is due to the lack of proper social models. Their impulsive temperament requires early restraint. Nevertheless, the mestizo possesses many inherent splendid attributes, including a robustness of body. She no longer wondered if Howard Doyle had kept a pair of calipers to measure skulls. Now she wondered how many he kept. Maybe they were in one of the tall cabinets behind her, along with the family's pedigree chart. There was a trash can next to the desk, and Noemi slid the journal she had been reading into the can. Page 40 is the first time I write, this is what Bly Manor tried to be. And it's just because of the vibe and like the servants and whatever. There's like nothing really that made me think it. It was just like what I was getting. She's going through they call it the English graveyard, which I guess is where the Englishmen who came over to help with the mine were buried after the sickness happened. The tombstones were blanketed with moss and mushrooms sprouted by the graves. It was a picture of melancholy. Even the trees seemed lugubrious, though Noemi could not say why. Trees were trees. It was the sum of it, she thought, and not the individual parts that made the English cemetery so sad. Neglect was one thing, but neglect and the shadows cast by the trees, and the weeds clustered by the tombstones, the chill in the air, served to turn what would have been an ordinary collection of vegetation and tombstones into a fiercely displeasing picture. She felt sorry for every single person buried there, just as she felt sorry for everyone living at High Place. Not for long, baby, not for long. Page 42, in the graveyard, is the first time she sees the family motto, et verbum caro factum est, which means the word becomes the flesh. Gross. She's talking to Francis, and he basically says that he's never been anywhere but High Place, that he was schooled at High Place and everything. And Noemi tried to think of the house filled with the noise of children's laughter, children playing hide and seek, children with a spinning top or a ball between their hands. But she couldn't. The house would not have allowed such a thing. The house would have demanded they spring from it fully grown. Chapter 5, Noemi gets to visit Catalina alone. When Catalina spoke, Noemi didn't mind because her words never sounded like her parents' reproaches. Catalina was a creature of sighs and phrases as delicate as lace. Catalina was a dreamer and therefore believed in Noemi's dreams. Catalina says she needs to get a medicine from a woman in town named Marta Duval, but no one will let her leave the house, and no one can know about this medicine, so Noemi has to get this medicine for her, and Noemi's like, all right, bet, yeah, no problem, but don't tell anybody. Oh my God, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody. All right, cool. Page 53. The doctor, the family doctor, Dr. Arthur Cummins, comes to look at Catalina, and Noemi's like, I want to talk to you, like, this shit is weird, she needs a psychiatrist, and she's very, like, melancholic, and Catalina's not an anxious person, and blah, 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 and they're like, well, she had depressive tendencies when she was little, and the tuberculosis has just brought it back, and Noemi's like, she wasn't depressed as a child, her mother died, like, that's a different story, and there's gaslighting the shit out of her. Your cousin has suffered from chills and night sweats. Codeine provides temporary relief. You cannot expect her to be baking pies. I'm concerned. She's my cousin after all. Yes, but if you begin to get agitated too, then we won't be better off, will we? The doctor said, shaking his head. Now I really must be going. I'll see you next week, Virgil. Doctor, Noemi said. No, I will be going, the doctor repeated, like a man who has become aware of an impending mutiny aboard a ship. Motherfucker. Just full of... Oh, and that guy, we're not going to talk about that guy yet. He's in on it. That night, Noemi dreamed that a golden flower sprouted from the walls in her room, only it wasn't. She didn't think it was a flower. It had tendrils, yet it wasn't a vine, and next to the not flower rose 100 other tiny golden forms. Mushrooms, she thought, finally recognizing the bulbous shapes. And as she walked toward the wall, intrigued and attracted by the glow, she brushed her hands against these forms. They burst into, like, smoke dust, and then she's, like, covered in smoke dust, and then she, like, falls down because the dust is, like, all around her, and then when she sits up, there's a woman in her room, glowing like the mushrooms, has no face, but is screaming at Noemi, and it's, like, terrifying. The woman made a noise like the crunching of leaves, like the dripping of water onto a pond, like the buzzing of insects in the pitch-black darkness, and Noemi wished to press her hands against her ears, but she had no hands anymore. The room was in shadows when she woke up. No light, golden or otherwise, dotted the wall's surface. Nevertheless, she had an impulse to rise and run her hands against the wall, as if to make sure there was nothing strange lurking behind the wallpaper. Spoiler alert, there's a lot of strange things lurking behind the wallpaper. Noemi wanted to be liked. Perhaps this explained the parties, the crystalline laughter, the well-coiffed hair, the rehearsed smile. She thought men such as her father could be stern and men could be cold, like Virgil, but women needed to be liked or they'd be in trouble. A woman who is not liked is a bitch, and a bitch can hardly do anything. All avenues are closed to her. The servants who won't talk to Noemi are named Lizzie, Mary, and Charles, who, like the porcelain locked in the cabinets, had been imported from England many decades ago. Just the way she writes, dude, I just cannot deal. I cannot deal. Oh, and then she's asking Francis about the sickness that happened in the mines. It wasn't clear. A high fever, very tricky. People would say the oddest things. They'd rant and rave. They'd have convulsions. They'd attack each other. People would get sick. They'd die. And then all would be well. And a few years later, the mystery illness would strike. And I marked that because that sounds like what's happening to Catalina. So at first I was like, the ground, like the land that the mine and the house is on is like outsiders not welcome. And it's like, it will kill you. Like it'll eat you up. And then kind of. She gets Francis to drive her into town. She goes and sees, like, a doctor that's, like, not the family doctor. And they're like, hey, can you come check on my cousin? And he's like, oh, the Doyles don't want me to do that. And she's like, please. And he's like, okay. And then she goes to Marta Duval and gets the medicine. Healer of Duval's sort was 2 steps removed from witchcraft, not only handing out tonics, but also curing the susto by placing a cross of holy palm on someone's head. No, Catalina wouldn't have been the type to wear a bracelet of Ojo de Venado on her wrist. How had she ended up at this house talking to Marta Duval then? So then Marta's like, hey, yeah, your cousin's sick because, like, the Doyles are cursed. That house is cursed. It's all very evil. And Noemi's like, how so? And Marta's like, you got to pay me. I'm not talking for free. All right. So she gives her some cigarettes. And then she's like, let me tell you. Ruth was Mr. Doyle's daughter, his darling child who wanted for nothing. Back then they had many servants, and they'd talk about all the pretty things at High Place and pretty Miss Ruth. She was going to marry her cousin, Michael. And they'd ordered a dress from Paris and ivory headcombs for her hair, but a week before the wedding, she grabbed a rifle and shot her groom, shot her mother, shot her aunt, shot her uncle. And she might have shot Virgil, her baby brother, but Miss Florence hid away with him, or maybe Ruth had mercy. A man named Richard came, that was Florence's husband. He wasn't like the Doyles, he was talkative. He lived in London, New York, and Mexico City. He was talkative, and then he started talking of strange things, of ghosts and spirits and the evil eye. He was a strong man, Mr. Richard, until he wasn't, and he looked rather shabby and thin, stopped coming into town, and disappeared from view. They found him at the bottom of a ravine. There's lots of ravines here, you might have noticed that. Well, there he was, dead at 29, left behind a son. Francis, she thought, pale-haired Francis, with his soft hair and his softer smile. And then on page 69, I wrote again, Bly Manor wishes, and this is why. It all sounds tragic, but I'm not sure I'd call it a curse. You'd call it coincidence, wouldn't you? Yes, I suppose you would, but the fact is, everything they touch rots. Rots. The word sounded so ugly, it seemed to stick to the tongue. It made Noemi want to bite her nails, even though she'd never done such a thing. She was particular about her hands. Ugly nails wouldn't have done for her. It was odd, that house. The Doyles and their servants were all an odd lot, but a curse? No. Yes. Kind of. Oh, I'm sorry, Frances did not take Noemi to town this time. She drove by herself, and Florence has a goddamn conniption because she likes things how they are, and you can't leave without telling her where you're going. Florence has managed High Place for decades, Virgil said, and as we do not have many visitors, you can imagine she's quite set in her ways too, and it's quite unacceptable, don't you think, for a visitor to ignore the rules of the house. Gaslighting motherfucker. For the second time, we talk about that there are emblems on all the rugs of the snakes eating their tails. Which are called Ouroboros? Ouroboros? I don't know. I'm gonna have to insert it here because I don't know how to pronounce it.
Ouroboros.
Then we find out that Howard was married to a woman named Agnes, who died when she was pregnant, and then he married her little sister, and had a bunch of babies with her. And then they were his cousins. So they were sisters, they were Howard's cousins, he married them both. Then you twice married your cousin, Noemi said, and your wife's sister. Is it scandalous? Catherine of Aragon was first married to Henry VIII's brother, and Queen Victoria and Albert were cousins. You think you're a king, then? Howard reached forward and patted her hand. His skin seemed paper thin and dry, smiling. Nothing as grandiose as that. Worse. Ew, 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 ew. She has a nightmare that night that Howard Doyle, walks into her room, his old gross ass, and, undresses her, and she's like, what does she say? Looked at Noemi like a man observing a butterfly pinned against a velvet cloth. He pressed a hand against her mouth. Oh no, this is when Howard turns into Virgil. And then Virgil presses a hand against her mouth, pushing her back against the bed, and the bed was very soft. It dipped and swayed, and it was like wax, like being pressed into a bed of wax, or perhaps mud, earth, a bed of earth. Blech. And then she keeps hearing someone say, open your eyes, open your eyes. The doctor from the town comes to see Catalina, and he's talking to her, and she's like, Catalina doesn't really want to talk to this guy. He asks about the remedy from Marta Duval, and Catalina's like, what the fuck, Noemi? Like, why would you say that? I'm just trying to figure out what all of your medications are, the doctor said. I'm assuming you saw her for a remedy. There's no remedy, Catalina muttered. She said something else, but it wasn't a real word. She babbled as like a small child, and then Catalina suddenly choked her neck as if she'd choke herself, but her grip was lax. No, it was not choking, but a defensive gesture, a woman guarding herself, holding her hands up in defense. The movement startled them both. What is it? Julio asked after a minute had gone by. It's the noise, Catalina said, as she slowly slid her hands up her neck and pressed them against her mouth. What noise? Noemi asked. I don't want you here. I'm very tired, Catalina said, and she gripped her hands together and placed them on her lap, closing her eyes as if to shut the visitors away. I really don't know why you must be here bothering me when I should be sleeping. If you will, the doctor began. I can't talk anymore. I'm exhausted, Catalina said, her hands trembling as she attempted to clutch them together. It's really quite exhausting being ill, and it's even worse when people say you shouldn't do anything. Isn't that odd? Really, I'm tired. Tired. She paused as if catching her breath. All of a sudden, Catalina opened her eyes very wide, and her face had a terrifying intensity to it. It was the visage of a woman possessed. There are people in the walls, Catalina said. There are people and there are voices. I see them sometimes. The people in the walls, they're dead. It lives in the cemetery. In the cemetery. Noemi, you must look in the cemetery. Then just as suddenly, Catalina stood up and went to the window, clutching a drape with her right hand and looking outside. Her face softened. It was as if a tornado had struck and spun away. Noemi didn't know what to do, and the doctor appeared equally baffled. I'm sorry, Catalina said evenly. I don't know what I say. I'm sorry. So Noemi goes to the cemetery to look for whatever Catalina was talking about, and it's super misty and foggy outside, and she can barely see the house from the cemetery. So she gets lost, which is very Gothic of her. A trick of the light might have made it appear as if that statue were moving. Yes, no doubt it had been a trick of the light, just like with the quickly glimpsed halo. She heard a rustling in the grass, and turning her head sharply, she noticed the shape had vanished. It couldn't have been a statue. She was suddenly unpleasantly aware of a buzzing, almost like a beehive, but not quite. It was loud, or no, loud was not the right word. She could hear it very clearly. Like the echo in an empty room, it seemed to bounce back to her. It lives in the cemetery. She ought to get back to the house. The sound was unpleasant. It made her want to go in the opposite direction, buzzing. Maybe it was flies. Flies as green as emeralds, their fat bodies on top of a piece of carrion meat, red and raw. And really, why must she think these things? Why must she stand like this with her hand in her pocket and her eyes wide, anxiously listening? You must look in the cemetery. Left, go left toward that mist, which seemed even thicker there, thick as gruel. And then Frances is there. She was spiraling! And then she's like, hey, I'm glad to see you. I need you to drive me to town again. Because when she went to see Marta was like, hey, that potion thing I made for your Catalina is not going to be ready for a week, so she'd come back. And Frances was like, I can't do that. And she's like, well, fuck you, don't talk to me then. Like, you're lame. I must seem ridiculous to you, a ridiculous fool clutching his mother's skirts. You'd be right, too. I dare not do anything to upset her, or to upset great Uncle Howard, especially Uncle Howard. She stretched out a hand, touching his fingers, which were dirty from handling mushrooms. I really am sorry, she said. He looked at her with great solemnity, and his fingers tightened around hers, and he gave her a little tug as if to pull her closer to him. But just as quickly, he released her and stepped back, grabbing the red cloth he carried atop his basket and handing it to her. I'm afraid I've dirtied you. Yes, Noemi looked at her hands smudged with soil. I guess you have. And I just wanted to read that part because trigger warning, attempted assault. Not going to get into details, but just so you know, in this book, there's 2 times that Virgil attempts to hurt Catalina, Noemi in that way. And this part right here about like Frances dirtying her and then immediately cleaning her up and like being sorry for like dirtying her and like she's pure and innocent and everything is like, it's such a contrast to the way that Virgil treats her as just like this sex object and this like beautiful thing to claim. And like, oh my God, it's just, we love Francis. We love him, even though he's like a baby, but like we love him. He is baby. And then Frances is like, hey, do you want to hang out with me and look at spore prints of mushrooms if you're not busy? And she's like, yeah, I will. So they go to the library. So she's asking him about Ruth and the murders and whatever. And Frances is like, I wasn't born. Who knows? This place could drive anyone crazy, he said angrily. His voice sounded loud in this quiet space of faded wallpaper and gilded frames. It seemed to bounce off the walls and return to them, scraping their skin with its harshness, almost booming. It startled her, this acoustic effect, and it also seemed to affect him. He hunched his shoulders, shrank down, trying to make himself smaller. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't raise my voice like that. The sound carries, and I'm being very rude. But like when you find out what the house is, it's almost like it's punishing him for talking badly about it. It's really crazy. All these little breadcrumbs that she drops that are just like really interesting sentences. And you're like, oh, that's a weird way. That's a cool way to say that. And you're like, oh shit. Like I literally am probably going to read this again today just to like go through again and be like, oh, that's what that meant there. That's what that meant there. Like it's so, oh my God. I liked this book a little bit if you couldn't tell. I love Frances. Page 111. I want to go into town tomorrow, Noemi said, and your mother said I can't take the car. I was thinking you might give me a ride there and pick me up a couple of hours later. You want me to drop you off in town, Frances said. Yes. He looked away, evading her gaze. My mother will not have it. She'll say you need a chaperone. Are you going to chaperone me? Noemi asked. I'm not a child. I know. Frances slowly walked around the table, stopping close to her and leaning down, inspecting one of the plant specimens on display. His fingers brushed lightly over a fern. They've asked me to keep an eye on you, he said, his voice low. They say you're reckless. I suppose you agree and you think I need a babysitter, she replied, scoffing. I think you can be reckless. But maybe I can ignore them this one time, he said, almost whispering, his head lowered as if to reveal a secret. We should leave early tomorrow around 8 o'clock before they're up and about, and don't tell anyone we're going out. I won't. Thank you. It is nothing, he replied, and turned his head to look at Noemi. This time his gaze lingered on her for one long minute before skittish, he stepped back and rounded a table, returning to his original position. A bundle of nerves is what he was. A heart, raw and bleeding, she thought, and the image lingered in her mind. The anatomical heart like in the Loteria cards, red with all veins and arteries rendered bright crimson. I love them! And then Florence is like, what are you talking about with my son? Like later on, she's like, what are you talking about with my son? And Naomi's like, stuff. If Howard reminded her of an insect, then Florence brought to mind an insectivorous plant about to swallow a fly. Noemi's brother had once owned a Venus flytrap. It had scared her a little as a child. Don't give my son any ideas. They will bring him pain. He doesn't need to hear about the frivolities you choose to share with him about Mexico City. I'll be sure to discuss with him the pre-approved subjects you dictate. Perhaps you can erase all the cities on the terrestrial globe and pretend they don't exist, Noemi said. You're very cheeky, Florence said, and you think you have a special power simply because my uncle thinks you possess a pretty face. But that's not power. It's a liability. She felt the wallpaper grow slippery like a strained muscle, and the floor beneath her was wet and soft. It was a sore, a great sore she walked upon, and the walls were sores too. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing underneath sickly organs instead of brick or wooden boards, veins and arteries clogged with secret excesses. She followed the beating of the heart and a thread of red on the carpet like a gash, a line of crimson, a line of blood, until she stopped in the middle of the hallway and saw the woman staring back at her. Ruth, the girl from the photograph. Ruth in a white dressing gown, her hair like a golden halo, her face bloodless. Ruth held a rifle between her hands and stared at Noemi. And then they go through the shooting of the family. Looked at Ruth, who had walked past Noemi and was now standing in the hallway, and the young woman looked back at Noemi. I'm not sorry, Ruth said, and she pressed the rifle against her chin and pulled the trigger. Oh, yeah, and she's sleepwalking during this, and she wakes up in Virgil's room, half naked. So she's in his room in like just her nightgown, but it's like a really thin nightgown or whatever, just doesn't have a robe on, and then she's like, sorry, I was sleepwalking, whatever, and he's like, sit down, like have some wine, here, have my robe, whatever, like it's fine, I'll walk you back to your room. And she's like, fine. She began to take the robe off. Virgil still, she gets back to her room. She began to take the robe off. Virgil stilled her, setting a hand on her shoulder and then carefully running his fingers down the edge of the wide lapel. You look very fine in my clothes, he said with that voice that was made of silk. Yeah, gross. You won't bid me goodnight, he asked, sounding amused, nor grant me a thank you? It would be rude not to. She turned toward him, looking at him in the eye. Thanks, she said. Better lock your door so you don't end up wandering around the house again, Noemi. I fucking hate him. Ew. The commentary that Sylvia's making about like the possessiveness of men and like men's like entitlement to women. Oh, she goes back to Marta, and Marta tells her about the strike that happened at the mines, about Aurelio who started a strike, and then he died randomly, mysteriously, whatever. And then Aurelio's son Benito was around, and everybody by that time had forgotten about Aurelio, and it was fine. And then Benito and Ruth fell in love, and Ruth wanted to run away with Benito, and when Howard found out, he literally strangled Ruth and almost killed her. They're heavy places where the air itself is heavy because an evil weighs it down. Sometimes it's a death, could be it's something else, but the bad air, it'll get into your body and it nestles there and weighs you down. That's what's wrong with the Doyles of High Place, the woman said, concluding her tale. Like feeding an animal matter plants, it dyes the bones red, it stains everything inside crimson. Wow, was she correct? Noemi brings home the medicine from Marta. Catalina takes like 4 teaspoons of it, and then she has a fucking seizure, and then everyone's like, what did you do to her? Like, you did this, you're terrible. This was an opium tincture, you're bad, and everyone's like gaslighting her, like, you tried to kill your cousin, like, you're terrible, and then Noemi just feels really, really bad. Oh, I just realized something. Okay, so she's back in the... Oh, man! Oh! See that thing about breadcrumbs? Oh, my God. Okay. I thought nothing of this when I first read it, but now reading it back, I'm like, duh. Okay, she goes back to the graveyard, and she's looking at Agnes Doyle's statue that was made for her when she died, and it says, Agnes Doyle, Mother, 1885. That was all Howard Doyle had chosen to leave behind to commemorate the passing of his first wife. It seemed odd to have a statue carved of her, but then not even compose a proper line or two about her passing. As far as Noemi knew, Howard Doyle's children were born of his second marriage. Why choose mother as this epithet then? Perhaps she was making too much of this. Yet it was unsettling in a way she could not define, like noticing a crooked seam or a tiny stain on a pristine tablecloth. Because Agnes is the mother of something. Francis tells her that she should leave. How could she hurt Catalina and run off? How could she leave her all alone, racked in pain? She's my family, Noemi said. You must stand by your family, even if you can't possibly help her. You don't know that. This is no place for you, he assured her. Have they asked you to chase me away? She asked, standing up quickly, irritated by his sudden vehemence. Are you trying to get rid of me? Do you dislike me so much? I like you very much, and you know it, he said, his hands sliding into his jacket's pockets again as he looked down. Then you'll help me and take me into town now, won't you? Why do you need to go into town? I need to find out what was in the tincture Catalina drank. It won't do any good. Even if it doesn't, I want to go. Will you take me? Not today. Tomorrow then. The day after tomorrow. Perhaps not. Why not make it in a month? She replied angrily. I can walk into town without you if you have no desire to help me. I have every desire to help you. I'm tired. We all are. Uncle Howard has been keeping us awake at nights, he said, shaking his head. Yes, he has. But not in the way you think. What has made Catalina so miserable, she asked. She was happy when she married, stupidly happy, my father would have said. Is Virgil cruel to her? Last night when I spoke to him, he was hard. He had no pity. It's the house, Francis murmured. By now the black gates with their snakes were in sight, the Ouroboros casting shadows upon the ground. It wasn't made for love, the house. Any place is made for love, she protested. Not this place and not us. You look back 2-3 generations as far as you can, you won't find love. We are incapable of such a thing. She has a dream that a woman is giving birth in the graveyard, and there's like a child and a man watching this woman give birth, and the man goes over to her, to the woman after she gives birth. He picks up the child, and he says, death overcome. But when he raised his arms, Noemi saw he held no child. The woman had given birth to a gray lump of flesh, almost egg-shaped, covered in a thick membrane and slick with blood. It was a tumor. It did not live, yet it pulsated gently. The lump quivered, and as it did, the membrane ruptured and slid aside. It burst, sending a golden cloud of dust into the air, and the man breathed in the dust. The woman's attendants, the people with their candles and their lanterns, and all the onlookers moved closer, holding their hands up as if to touch the golden dust, which slowly, ever so slowly, fell upon the ground. Only the little girl paid the shivering, exhausted figure on the ground any attention. The child approached her, pressed the cloth-shaven holding against the woman's face, as if veiling a bride, and held it tight. Death overcome, he said, and raised his eyes, staring at Noemi. It was then when he looked at her that she remembered to be afraid, that she remembered revulsion and horror and turned her face away. Her mouth had the coppery taste of blood, and in her ears there was a faint buzzing sound. When Noemi woke up, she was standing at the foot of the stairs, moonlight streaming through the colored glass windows, tinting her pale nightgown yellow and red. A clock struck the hour and the floorboards creaked, and she rested a hand on the banister, listening intently. And Florence is again like, stop spending so much time with Francis. It's no good to forget yourself nor your obligations. Francis has duties, he has chores. You pull him away from those chores, you make him forget his obligations. But surely he doesn't have chores all day long. Doesn't he? How would you know? Even if his days are made of leisure, why would he spend them with you? I don't mean to take up all his time, but I don't see he's silly when he is with you. He completely forgets who he's supposed to be. And do you think Howard would let him have you? Florence shook her head. The poor boy, she muttered. What do you want, What do you want from us? There's nothing left to give. I wanted to apologize, Noemi said. Florence pressed a hand against her right temple and closed her eyes. You have. Go. And Noemi, it doesn't even register to Noemi what the fuck Florence just said. You think Howard would let him have you? So that was I was like, have her? Howard would let him have her? For what? Yikes. Catalina and Noemi are like sitting in Catalina's room, and Catalina's like, read this book to me. And she gives Noemi the book, and then a piece of paper tucked in the pages falls out, and Catalina's like purposely not looking at Noemi. She's looking at the maid and like looks terrified. So Noemi like really quickly takes the piece of paper out, and she's like, okay, Catalina wrote me a letter, like let's see what it is. But it's not Catalina, it is Ruth. I put these thoughts down on paper because it is the only way to remain firm in my resolve. Tomorrow I may lose courage, but these words should anchor me to the here and now, to the present moment. I hear their voices constantly, whispering. They glow at night. Perhaps that might be endurable. This place would be endurable if not for him. Our Lord and Master, our God, an egg split asunder and a mighty serpent rising from it, expanding wide its jaws. Our great legacy, spun in cartilage and blood and roots so very deep. Gods cannot die. That is what we have been told, what Mother believes. But Mother cannot protect me. She cannot save any of us. It is up to me. Whether this is sacrilege or simple murder or both. He beat me when he found out about Benito, but I swore there and then that I would never bear a child nor do his will. I believe firmly this death will be no sin. It is a release and my salvation. R. And she's like, this shit's weird. I'm gonna talk to Francis. And she's like, Francis, you think your house is haunted? He's like, I don't know. Like, what do you mean? And I was like, Noemi was struck with the desire to lean forward and kiss him, a feeling like wishing to light a match, a burning, bright, and eager feeling. Yet she hesitated. It was easy to kiss someone when it didn't matter. It was more difficult when it might be meaningful. Oh, you could have everyone in a room going mad and it's the paint job. Francis stood up suddenly and gripped her hands. Don't speak another word, Francis told her, his voice low. He spoke in Spanish. They'd stuck to English since she arrived at this house. She didn't recall him using one word of Spanish at High Place. Do you think I'm mad like those hatters? She asked, also in Spanish. Dear God, no, I think you're sane and clever, much too clever, perhaps. Why won't you listen to me? Really listen. Leave today. Leave right this instant. This is no place for you. What do you know that you aren't telling me? He stared at her, his hand still gripping her own. Noemi, just because there are no ghosts, it doesn't mean you can't be haunted, nor that you shouldn't fear the haunting. You are too fearless. My father was the same way, and he paid dearly for it. A loud moan echoed down the hall and then another. Frances stepped away from her. The acoustics in this place, they were odd. It made her wonder why sound traveled so well. It's Uncle Howard. He's in pain again, Frances said, grimacing, so that it looked like he was the one in agony. He can't hold on much longer. I'm sorry, it must be difficult for you. You have no idea. If only he'd die. She's taking a bath, and then Virgil's there. And this is so gross, and this is borderline assault. So I will put a timestamp where we're not gonna talk about this anymore, but I have to mention it because it's like really disturbing writing. There you are, you pretty little thing, he said. No need to speak, no need to move. Shame and surprise and anger shot through her body. What the hell did he think he was doing? She was going to yell at him. She was going to yell at him and cover herself, and not only yell, she'd slap him. She'd slap him once she was in her bathrobe, but she didn't move at all. They can make you think things, a voice whispered. She'd heard that voice before. They make you do things. She wanted to open her mouth a little, but not to speak. She wanted to tell him to get out and couldn't, and it made her tremble with fright. You'll be a good girl, won't you? Virgil said. He reached it in the bathtub and knelt down to look at her, smiling. It was a cunning, crooked smile set in perfectly sculpted face, and he was so close to her that she could see there were flecks of gold in his eyes. She was petrified, like the unwary character in an old myth. She was the victim of the Gorgon. Such a good girl, I know it. Be good to me. Open your eyes, the voice said, but her eyes were wide open, and he'd woven his fingers into her hair, making her lift her head up. Blah, and then they kiss, and she's like, oh, I actually really like it. I actually really like it. And the voice is like, open your eyes. And then she does, and then she hears the bees, and then she hears open your eyes again and realizes it's Ruth with blood in her hands and blood on her face and her nails kicked with blood, and the bees were inside her head, tunneling through Noemi's ears. Noemi snapped her eyes open. Water was dripping down her back and her fingertips, and the bathrobe she was wearing was not cinched. It lay loose and open, showing her nakedness. She was barefoot. And guess where she sleptwalked to again? Virgil's room, naked, after having a sex dream about him. What a surprise. Wonder if that's a coincidence. Not at all. And he's like, what did you dream tonight? And she said she did not wish to blush in front of him, to turn crimson like an idiot in front of a man who wielded such meticulous hostility toward her. But she thought of his mouth on hers and his hands on her thighs like it had been in the dream. That night, that dream, it had felt like desire, danger, and scandals, and all the secrets her body and her eager mind quietly coveted, the thrill and shamelessness, and of him. She blushed after all. Virgil smiled, and even though it was impossible, she was sure that he knew exactly what she had dreamed and that he was waiting for her to give him the smallest hint of invitation. The fog in her brain was clearing, though, and she remembered the words in her ear. Open your eyes. Noemi curled a hand into a fist, her nails digging in her palm, and shook her head. Something terrible, she said. Virgil seemed confused, then disappointed. His face turned ugly as he grimaced. Perhaps you were hoping to sleepwalk into Frances's room. Go to sleep, she said, but in her mind she thought, fuck you, and her tone plainly indicated that. She snatched the lamp and left him in the shadows. And then she's awake and she sees this like pattern moving, like the mold in the wallpaper is moving, and then it like sinks, and then she like, that's when she burns herself, and she like freaks out, and I guess she's screaming, but she doesn't realize she's screaming because then everyone's like, what are you doing? Like, why are you smoking in your room again? Because you're not allowed to smoke in your room. And she's like, fuck you guys, like I want to see Catalina. And Catalina's like, I'm fine, you're being crazy. And then Noemi's like, fuck this, I'm getting out of here. And they're like, all right, well, you can leave in the morning. And then Virgil's like, please don't smoke, it disturbs us. The house doesn't like when she smokes in it. And then we find out Catalina intends to fund the reopening of the mine. So then they're like, you can't leave till you say goodbye to Howard. And then they take her to Howard's room, And Howard's laying there naked on his bed. His skin was terribly pale and his veins contrasted grotesquely against his whiteness, indigo lines running up and down the body. Yet that was not the worst of it. One of his legs was hideously bloated, crusted over with dozens of large dark boils. She had no idea what they were, not tumors, no, for they pulsed quickly, and their fullness contrasted with his emaciated body. The skin grown taut, I'm gonna throw up. The skin grown taut against the bones, except upon that leg where the boils grew as thick as barnacles upon a ship's hull. It was horrid, horrid, and she thought he was a corpse, affected by the ravages of putrefaction, but he lived. His chest rose and dipped, and he breathed. You must get closer, Virgil whispered into her ear and clasped her tight by the arm. And they're all like pushing her toward Howard, and then Virgil like grabs her fucking head and like blah. Howard Doyle turned his head up on the pillow and looked at her. His lips were as bloated as his leg, crusted with black growths, and a trail of dark fluid dripped down his chin, staining his bedclothes. This was the source of the bad smell in the room, and up close the stench was so awful she thought she would retch. And the man was rising in his bed, turning and stretching out a thin hand, his fingers digging into Noemi's hair and pulling their faces closer. His eyes were not blue, they were diluted by a bright golden sheen, like flecks of molten gold. Howard Doyle smiled at her, showing off his black-stained teeth, and pressed his lips against hers. So here's what's wrong with the Doyles. Basically, and it's very confusing. I'm not going to explain it well. It's not confusing in the book. It's just like I am having a hard time vocalizing it. It's easier to just read it. But she sees this flashback of long time ago in a cave, and Doyle's there, and he's watching this priest like die and like give his body to these mushrooms, and basically like through a combination of like science, alchemy, like eugenics, and this magical living mushroom thing, the Doyles have like bred this like symbiotic relationship with this living mushroom species, and they call it the gloom. The gloom is like where Noemi has been having these dreams and stuff. It basically gets into you like via the food, via like the house, the air, like it's all like infecting Catalina and Noemi. And the reason Catalina is so sick is because she'd been fighting the gloom. She didn't want to be taken over by it. The tincture that Marta was giving her was helping to fight the gloom, and the reason that she had a seizure when she took that much of it was because it was too much at once, and her body like didn't know, like the gloom inside her like freaked out. But if you take it a little bit at a time, you can fight the gloom, and that's when she'd been writing the letters about they're speaking to me like they're scaring me. And the reason that Noemi gets to know this and why Howard kissed her like that to show her that is because Noemi is basically like spoken for Francis, because Howard is dying. He needs a new body. Basically, he just has kept all his family inbreeding to like keep the symbiotic tie to the mushrooms as strong as possible, so that he can just keep body hopping in his own family into the men. And so they obviously need new blood because the inbreeding's getting fucking weird and they're running out of women. So he decides he's gonna body hop into Francis because he's dying. Francis will cease to exist, and then he's gonna marry Noemi because he wants Noemi. She's pretty and he wants to have her. And so that's been the whole thing from the moment Noemi came in. Howard was like, I'm gonna take Francis's body and I'm gonna have you. Yeah, 300 years marrying his own kin, having children with them, and transferring his mind into one of their bodies over and over again, and you allow this. We have no choice. He's a god. You have a damn choice, and that sick fuck is not a god. He is to us, and he wants you to be part of our family. That's why he poured that black sludge down my throat. They were afraid you were going to leave. They couldn't let you do that. Now you won't be able to go anywhere. I don't want to be part of your goddamn family, Francis. And believe me, I'm going to go back home, and it won't let you go. And that's why Francis's dad, Richard, had drowned himself in the ravine, because he couldn't leave. So he was just like, I'm gonna kill myself. And that is also why Ruth killed herself, because the gloom that's controlled by Howard forced her to, as punishment for shooting him, because she did shoot Howard, but he's like so super powerful or whatever that it didn't kill him. It just like destroyed him. I guess they hope you will be more understanding. That I'll be happy to join your family. That I'll be happy to what? Give you my money? Give you children? Yes. Yes to both. Doyle had perfected the ritual. Clever Doyle, who was well learned and had read plenty of books on theology, biology, medicine, looking for answers, and now he'd found them. Noemi thought they would kill the woman now, that they would cut her up and ingest her, but she was wrong. They swaddled the body, swaddled it tight, and there was a pit by the altar, and they were throwing her into it, but she was alive. She's not dead, Noemi told them, but it didn't matter. It was a memory. It was necessary, always is. The fungus would erupt up from her body, up through the soil, weaving itself into the walls, extending itself into the foundations of the building, and the gloom needed a mind. It needed her. The gloom was alive. It was alive in more than one way. At its rotten core, there was the corpse of a woman, her limbs twisted, her hair brittle against the skull, and the corpse stretched its jaw open, screaming inside the earth, and from her dried lips emerged the pale mushroom. The priest would have sacrificed himself, part of the body devoured, the rest buried, life erupting from those remains, and the congregation tied to him, tied ultimately to their God. But Doyle was no fool who would offer himself in sacrifice. Doyle could be a god without having to obey their arcane, foolish rules. Doyle existed, persisted. Doyle always is. Monsters. Monstrum, ah. Is that what you think of me, Noemi? Have you seen enough, curious girl? Doyle asked. Why do you show me this? She asked. The house shows you. The house loves you. Are you enjoying our hospitality? Would you like to play with me? He asked. You don't scare me, you piece of shit monster with your dreams and your tricks. This isn't real, and you'll never keep me here. You really think that? He asked, and the boils rippled down his back. A trickle of black liquid as black as ink dripped onto the floor beneath him. I can make you do anything I want. He sliced one of the pustules in his hand with a long nail, pressing it against a silver cup, and it broke, filling the cup with a foul liquid. Have a drink, he said, and for a second she felt compelled to step forward and take a sip. He smiled. He was trying to show her his power. Even in dreams, he was the master. You're ours, like it or not. You're ours and you're us. So then she decides to try to run away, but then she can't breathe, and she scratches herself, and she's stumbling around and getting really sick, and then Virgil finds her and picks her up and brings her inside and puts her in the bathtub and makes her get undressed in front of him. I can make you get out of those clothes. It won't take a minute, and I will hurt you, or you can take them off yourself like a good girl. Gross, 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 gross. And then Francis interrupts, thank God, because he's about to do the same thing that he did in the dream to her again. They realize that the doctor is also part of the family, and that's why he never was able to heal the people who were getting the sickness, because the house, the gloom, the family was feeding off of them, and there was nothing to cure because he wanted the gloom to be fed because he's part of the gloom. I don't know if I can trust you, she said to Virgil. Why would you help me? There's a cicada fungus, Massospora cicadina. I remember reading a journal article which discussed its appearance. The fungus sprouts along the abdomen of the cicada. It turns it into a massive yellow powder. The journal said the cicadas, which had been so grossly infected, were still singing as their body was consumed from within. Singing, calling for a mate, half dead. Can you imagine? You're right, I do have a choice. I'm not going to end my life singing a tune, pretending everything is fine. You've managed to pretend so far. She stared at him, and he stared back at her gravely. Yes, he said, and now you're here, and I can't anymore. And he's like, I'm gonna get you guys out. There's secret tunnels under the house that can take you up to the mountain. You and Catalina are gonna get out. I can't leave. She's like, you have to come with us. This house had been built atop bones, and no one had noticed such an atrocity. Rows and rows of people streaming into the house, into the mine, and never leaving. Never to be mourned, never to be found. The serpent does not devour its tail. It devours everything around it, voracious, its appetite never quenched. My mother tried to escape, Francis countered. My mother and Virgil, and they came back. He laughed without joy, and she could very well believe he would stay behind. A cephalophore martyr of cold marble who'd let the dust accumulate on his shoulders, who'd allow the house to gently, slowly devour him. You'll come with me, but nothing. Don't you want to leave this place? She insisted. His shoulders were hunched, and he looked as if he would bolt for the door at any second. But then he took a shaky breath. For God's sake, you can't be that blind, he replied, his voice low and harrowed. I would follow you wherever you may go, to the damn Antarctic. If I'd freeze my toes off, who cares? Was everyone in this house a moth caught in a killing jar and then pinned against a board? Noemi falls asleep and sees Ruth in the gloom again. They walk around in the cemetery. The mist was thick around them, and Ruth carried a lantern which glowed a sickly yellow. They paused before the entrance to the mausoleum, and Ruth raised the lantern, and they both raised their heads to look at the statue of Agnes that I mentioned earlier that says mother. The lantern could not provide sufficient illumination. This is our mother, Ruth said. She sleeps. Not your mother, Noemi thought, for Agnes had died young as had her child. Our father is a monster who comes at night, creeping around this house. You can hear his footsteps outside the door. Your father can't hurt you anymore, Noemi said, because at least there was that mercy, she supposed. Ghosts cannot be tormented. But the girl grimaced. He can always hurt us. He never stops hurting us. He will never stop. And Noemi is correct that Agnes died while pregnant and never had her baby, but she is incorrect that Agnes is not a mother. Because the dream that the gloom showed her of a woman being suffocated and stuck in a hole in the ground in the altar room and the mushrooms growing from her was correct. It is Agnes, trapped, kept alive by the mushrooms, feeding them and controlling them, like giving them a livelihood. They're controlled by Howard, obviously, but she is the mother because she is, from her, all the mushrooms are blooming, infecting the house, infecting the residents, infecting anyone who they want to infect. So she is the mother of everything in that house. They have to get married in front of Howard, but he can't get out of the bed, so they go in there. The air was foul with the stench of food gone sour, and Howard still laid in bed, his lips black and covered with pustules, but this time he was under the covers. In a church there would have been the smell of incense. Here was the perfume of putrefaction. She was reluctant to place it in her mouth, lest it inhibit or reduce the progress of the tincture she'd been secretly imbibing, but more than that, its provenance disturbed her. Had it been collected from the grounds near the house, or had it come from the cemetery riddled with corpses, or else had it grown upon Howard's flesh and been plucked with nimble fingers, blood flowing where the stem was severed? I almost just threw up in my mouth. And Virgil tries to her again, and he's like influencing her mind using the gloom to like make her just be cool with it. Her body, which had been cold, now felt too hot, and the mold dripped down, forming a black puddle in the corner of the room. It reminded her of the black bile that Howard had spit down her throat, and that memory awoke a wave of disgust, her mouth tasting sour, and she thought of Catalina and Ruth and Agnes and the terrible things they'd done to them, which they'd now do to her. And she hits Virgil in the head, but then doesn't kill him, which is always a mistake. "He's your son," Noemi whispered. "It's a body," Florence replied, her face stiff. "A body. That's what they all were to them. The bodies of miners in the cemetery, the bodies of women who gave birth to their children, and the bodies of those children who were simply the fresh skin of the snake. And there on the bed lay the body that mattered, the father." And they all kneel around Howard's bed to pray, and they're all there, except Virgil, because he's knocked out, and they're like, all right, this is happening. Catalina softly, quietly had edged closer to the bed. Her movements had gone unnoticed. All heads were down praying, after all, except for Noemi's. Catalina seized the doctor's scalpel and was looking at it, very much like a dreamer, very much like someone who does not recognize the object in their hands, still caught in a vague, soporific state. Then her expression changed. A startled flash of recognition came over her, and then a spark of rage. Noemi wasn't aware that Catalina could be capable of such rage. It was naked hatred. It made Noemi gasp, and at last, Howard seemed to notice something amiss and turned his head, only to feel the scalpel descend into his face. The blow was fierce, going straight into an eye. Catalina became a maenad. Her frenzied stabbing, the scalpel bit the neck, the ear, the shoulder, brought forth a river of black pus and dark blood splattering the covers. Howard yelled and shook as if an electric current ran through the body, and the others in the room echoed him, their bodies convulsing. The doctor, Florence, Francis, fell upon the floor, seized by a terrible paroxysm. So then her and Catalina run away. Florence finds a gun somewhere and says, "There's no way you can ever leave us." Francis shoots his mom. Gets some balls, shoots his mom, love him so much. But the other eye remained open and monstrous and golden, staring at them. He spat out blood, spat out black mucus. "You're mine, your body is mine," he said. And in this context, reading it right now, he's obviously talking to Francis, but when I first read this as a woman, I'm assuming he's talking to Noemi, because this whole thing is just like a giant metaphor for like the entitlement of men, and him being like, your body's mine, like you're mine, you're mine. And I was like, well, technically he is talking to Francis, being like, I need your body to live, but he's also talking to Noemi, being like, your body as an object is mine. Francis winced suddenly and bent down. Noemi thought he was about to retch, but he stood like that with his arms wrapped around his belly. "What is it?" Noemi asked. "It's painful," he said. "She's in pain." "Who?" "She's speaking." Noemi became aware of a sound. It had been there all along, but she had not paid attention to it. It was very low, almost inaudible, and it would have been easy to think she was imagining it. It was a hum, and also very much unlike a hum. The buzzing noise she'd heard on other occasions, only the pitch this time seemed higher. "Don't look." Noemi turned around. There was a yellow drape. Noemi raised a hand. Don't, Catalina said. You don't want to see. Don't look. Bees seemed to flutter against her fingertips, the air alive with unseen wings, but her instinct was to step back to shield her eyes, but she clutched the fabric and yanked it aside with such force, she almost ripped it to the ground. Noemi stared straight into the face of death. It was the open, screaming maw of a woman frozen in time, a mummy with few teeth dangling from her mouth, her skin yellow. The clothing in which she had been buried had long dissolved into dust, but instead she was clothed in a different finery. Mushrooms hid her nakedness. They grew from her torso and her belly. They grew down her arms and her legs. They clustered around her head, creating a crown, a halo of glowing gold. The mushrooms held her upright, anchored her to the wall like a monstrous virgin in a cathedral of mycelium. And it was this thing, dead and buried for years and years, that made that buzzing noise. It made that terrible sound. This was the golden blur she'd seen in her dreams, the terrifying creature that lived in the walls of the house. It held out an outstretched hand, and upon that hand it wore an amber ring. She recognized it from the painting. Agnes, Noemi said, and the buzzing, it was terrible and sharp, and it pulled her down, and it made her see, and it made her know. Look. The pressure of the cloth against her face suffocating her until she lost consciousness, only to wake up in a coffin. Her startled gasps, because despite being prepared for this, despite knowing what must happen, she was scared. Her palms pressing against the lid of the coffin again and again, splinters digging into her skin, and she screamed, tried to push her way out. The coffin did not yield. She screamed and screamed, but nobody came. Nobody was supposed to come. This was the way it was meant to be. Clever Doyle, with his knowledge of scientific and alchemical matters, with his fascination with biological processes, Doyle had understood all the possibilities nobody else had grasped. A mind. The fungus needed a human mind that could serve as a vessel for memories, that could offer control. The fungus and the proper human mind fused together were like wax, and Howard was like a seal, and he imprinted himself upon new bodies like a seal on a paper. Now there was no Agnes. Agnes was the gloom, and the gloom was Agnes, and Howard Doyle, even if he perished this instant, would still exist in the gloom, for he had created wax and a seal and paper. And it hurt. It was in pain. The gloom, Agnes, the mushrooms, the house, heavy with rot, with hidden tendrils extending beneath and up its walls, feeding on all manner of dead matter. He is hurt. We are hurt. Look, look, look. The buzzing had acquired a fever pitch. It was so loud, Noemi covered her ears and screamed. Don't look at her, Francis said. We are never supposed to look at her. All of the ghosts were Agnes, or rather, all the ghosts lived inside Agnes. No, that wasn't right either. What had once been Agnes had become the gloom, and inside the gloom there lived ghosts. It was maddening. It was not a haunting. It was possession, and not even that, but something she couldn't even begin to describe. The creation of an afterlife, furnished with the marrow and the bones and the neurons of a woman made of stems and spores. Virgil shows up, and he's like, Francis is like, I'll fucking kill you, don't touch them. And he's like, we can share, like, chill out, like, I want both of them, and you can have Noemi if you want, like, it's all good, like, we'll just share, it's fine. And then Francis doesn't give up, so then Virgil tries to make him swallow his own tongue. Noemi heard the growing buzzing of bees behind her. Look. She turned around and her eyes fell on the face of Agnes, her lipless mouth set in an eternal circle of pain, and she pressed her hands against her ears, furiously wondering why it wouldn't stop, why the noise wouldn't cease. And it struck her all of a sudden, this fact that she had missed what should have been obvious from the very beginning, that the frightening and twisted gloom that surrounded them was the manifestation of all the suffering that had been inflicted on this woman. Agnes driven to madness, driven to anger, driven to despair, and even now, a sliver of that woman remained, and that sliver was still screaming in agony. She was the snake biting its tail. She was a dreamer, eternally bound to a nightmare, eyes closed even when her eyes had turned to dust. The buzzing was her voice. She could not communicate properly any longer, but she could still scream of unspeakable horrors inflicted on her, of ruin and pain. Even when coherent memory and thought had been scraped away, the searing rage remained, burning the minds of any who wandered near it. What did she wish? Simply to be released, simply to wake up, but she couldn't. She couldn't ever wake. Sleepwalker, Noemi whispered, time to open your eyes. She tossed the lamp against the corpse's face. It instantly ignited the mushrooms around Agnes's head, creating a halo of fire, and then tongues of fire began to spread quickly down the wall, the organic matter apparently as good as kindling, making the mushrooms blacken and pop. And then the boys, Virgil and Francis, collapse because the thing that's keeping them alive is burning, and then the whole house burns down, and Frances is like super, super weak, and the girls get out. Old paintings bubbling, faded photographs curling into nothingness, doorways arched with fire. Howard Doyle's portraits of his wives were consumed by flames, and his bed now a bed of fire, and his decayed and heaving body choked by smoke, while on the floor his physician lay immobile, and the fire began to lick at the bed covers, began to eat Howard Doyle inch by inch, and the old man screamed, but there was no one who would assist him. Invisible beneath the paintings and the linens and the plates and the glass, she imagined masses of fine threads, delicate mycelium, also burning and snapping, fueling the conflagration. The house blazed in the distance. Let it burn until it was all reduced to ashes. And then Francis wakes up and he's freaking out because he had a dream that it's still all there, and then like, oh my god. I dreamed the house had stitched itself together and I was inside of it, and this time there was no way out. I was alone in the house and all the doors were sealed. And then Francis is like, it's still in my blood, I should kill myself. And Noemi's like, bro, no, you're not gonna kill yourself. Like, I love you. She wondered whether one day, if she looked carefully, she might notice a golden sheen to Francis's eyes, or maybe she'd catch her own reflection staring back at her with eyes of molten gold. The world might indeed be a cursed circle. The snake swallowed its tail and there could be no end, only an eternal ruination and endless devouring. I thought I dreamed you, Frances said, still a little sleepy. I'm real, she replied. Future, she thought, could not be predicted, and the shape of things could not be divined. To think otherwise was absurd, but they were young that morning, and they could cling to hope. Hope that the world could be remade, kinder and sweeter. So she kissed him a second time for luck. When he looked at her again, his face was filled with such an extraordinary gladness, and the third time she kissed him, it was for love. I read this at night by myself in my home, and I had to watch Bob's Burgers for 2.5 hours to feel safe enough to sleep. That shit freaked me out. This book freaked me. I loved it. Freaked me out. If you'd like to get a piece of paper and a pen ready, or pull your notes app up on your phone, Sylvia Moreno Garcia has also written books called The Beautiful Ones, Certain Dark Things, Signal to Noise, Gods of Jade and Shadow, and Untamed Shore. I'm buying all of them. I don't know if you could tell, I fucking love this woman and her writing. I'm sure everything else she's written is fucking gold, because this was... Were you listening at all? I don't know how long this video was. I do not know how long I've talked. It's gotten dark outside. What was I supposed to do? What was I supposed to do? I didn't even read all of the things I marked, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that, because that is the last book review that we're going to be doing in this year. I have videos for the rest of December planned already, but none of them are book reviews. Next week is going to be the long-awaited second part to my writing process, how I actually self-publish my books through Kindle Direct. I go through it beat by beat. I tell you how I get my cover. I tell you how I get reviews. I tell you how I put everything in and make sure that it looks good. I tell you what not to do when trying to get your proofs. Give you all the advice that I have after doing this twice and messing it up both times. And then I have a very exciting video coming after that with a very special clandestine announcement. If you've been following me on Instagram, you saw that I posted a date on my Instagram and said something was coming on that date. It is the video revealing something very exciting that I can't talk to you about yet. And then after that, we're gonna do like a 2020 recap goals video, more announcements. In the meantime, go read Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Tell your friends about it. Go read everything by this woman. I'm shook. I'm shook. I did not think this late in the year we'd get a new favorite book of the year, but here we are. Here we are. Yeah. I'll see you guys next week.